Okay, it's now streaming.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining us for our third and final live discussion for TEDx UNC Charlotte. Joining us tonight, we have three of our speakers. Octavia Lopez unfortunately was unable to join, but we are really excited to be here with David Goldfield, Brittany Danielle Hunt, and Connor Wood. So my name is Michael. I am the lead organizer for TEDx UNC Charlotte. I'll be one of our co-hosts this evening. Our other co-host is Jordan Harris. I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Jordan Harris.
Short and succinct as always, Jordan. So we'll just jump in and get started with some of our questions for our speakers, and I'll have Jordan kick it off.
There we go. I'll unmute myself. All right, so Brittany, we're gonna tee it up for you. Can you talk about the significance and importance it is for students to have professors, instructors, advisors, and campus leaders be reflective of the student population?
Yeah, so I think it's very important. I think visibility is really critical, and that's one of the things that I really wanted to highlight in my TED Talk. A lot of times Indigenous students, Indigenous people in general are kind of invisibilized in America's narrative, in the media narrative, in curriculum, in television and in film. And so it's really important to have representations of Native people that kind of break through that invisibility and that demonstrate that we are very much still here. We're very much still a vibrant part of the fabric that is America. And so I think representation is really critical. And I think also seeing someone who looks like you doing something is almost a trigger point to you to show you that you can do it yourself. And so I think that that is something that's really critical for students, especially who are still trying to figure out their way and make their way in the world. And so, yeah, that's one thing I really wanted to highlight in my talk.
I think you did a really, really good job with that. So are your career plans to stay in academia to fulfill that prophecy?
Yes, I definitely want to stay in academia. So once I graduate, which will be hopefully in May, it will be in May. I plan to seek a tenure track position in academia where I can become a full professor eventually. So that's my ultimate goal, is to teach teachers so we can kind of disrupt this harmful curriculum that's now being taught to students that are racist, Native people so violently. So, yes.
I think that's a really great goal, and I have full confidence that you will be such an empowering and good role model as a professor for your students in the future. Because I mean, Jordan and I have such a friend crush on you. We think that you are just such a cool person. All right, so we're gonna move on.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We're gonna move to Connor. So can you talk a little bit about how you think the cost of college housing costs interacts with off-campus student housing costs? Like, is there a relationship there?
Between on-campus and off-campus?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there actually is. So on-campus typically sets the price point for off-campus because off-campus housing is typically marketed in a way that it's cheaper than to live on campus for nicer amenities. So when on-campus housing has low rates or low amenities, and typically this is at older universities with not as renovated housing, their off-campus markets are typically cheaper. But when universities build and build and build or have very renovated on-campus housing, the off-campus housing rates have a lot more flexibility and like fluctuation in what their price points are.
Thank you for elaborating on that. So one of the things that I've noticed, especially with UNC Charlotte, is all of the luxury off-campus apartments that are immediately surrounding the university. And the way that these off-campus apartments are injecting upgrades in their current housing. And how does that, do you think that's reasonable and responsible approach to addressing student housing and like with all of these luxury apartments being thrown up?
No, I think there's a give and take there because traditional student housing off campus is largely single family homes that aren't updated between renters, as well as they're given by landlords that typically sometimes don't care about the students who live there. And so you have these really run down college neighborhoods, which are a whole drawback, but they're very cheap. but the housing isn't as good. But on the other side, you have these brand new complexes that offer so many amenities that students want, based on leasing from August to July in the academic year, offering subleasing opportunities, monthly rents where if your roommate doesn't pay, you don't get evicted, you only pay your part. And so it's a really easy way to do that. And so this has become a big trend because it's so easy for students. But on the other hand, these complexes have all these new amenities, these different price points. And so they have the ability to upcharge. And then in this market itself, there's so much overturn between the complexes, they just continually flip. And we see this in the national housing market in general, with apartments getting bought out every few years. As soon as they build, they make a profit and they flip. And this is just really hard for students when students don't have the voice in the community and politics that citizens do of a city to say no. Like, students really don't do that. So it's hard.
Thank you.
So I'm going to piggyback off of that tension that we see in on and off-campus housing. And David, we've seen it played out in the last several months with COVID-19 relief and now mail-in voting. In your opinion, why does there always appear to be this great unproductive tension between local, state, and national governments? Yep, you got to unmute.
Thank you. The mission of each of those governments is very different. State and local governments have to balance their budgets. The federal government does not. And that means that the federal government can be much more creative in aiding the economy. For example, with this pandemic and the high unemployment that we're having, the federal government has stepped in, probably not as much as it should have, but nonetheless, we're running rather huge deficits. But state and local governments cannot do that. So there are tensions when state and local governments look to the federal government, as they are right now, for help, particularly financial help, because state and local governments have these restrictions on them. So it's really a function of the specific roles of each level of government. To give you one more specific example, education. President Trump said today that he's just sick and tired of the way we meaning high schools teach American history, that there's too much bad news in American history. And he was particularly critical of the 1619 Project of the New York Times, which traces, as many of you know, which traces the origins of slavery from 1619 through the present. So that's well of him to say, but the federal government has no impact on local school districts. Local school districts, it's not like, say, Sweden or the UK or Germany. Local school districts run their own shop. They do get guidance from the state, but certainly not from the federal government. They do get some help from the federal government for impoverished students, but in terms of curriculum, the federal government does not have an impact on that. So I'm not sure what he was talking about, but education is a good example of how localized our government system is. Another example is voting. Allegedly, we're having a national election on November 3rd, but in fact, elections take place in individual states. The Electoral College is geared towards state elections, not really a national voting. You will see many national polls showing candidate X ahead of candidate Y. That's irrelevant, totally irrelevant, because this is not a national election. What you need to do is you need to focus on those so-called battleground states and see how the candidates are playing out and their voting percentages in those states, because the electoral process, like education, is really a state matter, not national.
Thank you for that. And so you actually said something that I'm going to ping back to Brittany. It's the idea that the truth can be ugly. So let's somewhat avoid that. How do you respond to that, Brittany, when your talk really did focus on the idea that we talk about Southern heritage, Southern existence through a very narrow lens? How do you address the idea that our history is so ugly that people want to avoid talking about it?
Yeah, so I could probably do like 8 TED Talks on this, like a whole Netflix series. So I think that once you get into censoring the truth of history, that's when you are really getting into dangerous waters, and you're becoming like the countries that we like to criticize so much. I think that particularly from an Indigenous perspective, we see our histories either totally unreflected in the curriculum at all, or so whitewashed to the point that we are not reflected in ways that are humanizing or even truthful, to just be quite honest. And so I think that if you don't teach students the truth of history, we are very much bound to repeat the mistakes that our ancestors have made in the past. So I think that teaching the truth so that we can raise up an educated electorate is it's a critical component should be a critical component to any nation. And so I think that that's a very important thing, is to teach the truth no matter how uncomfortable. We're very comfortable in America teaching about the evils that other countries do, but we're very uncomfortable with teaching about the evils that we have often laid the groundwork for other countries to create. So even a lot of people don't know that that Hitler based his concentration camps on the reservation system in America, and how you can take a large group of people and put them into a very small area, and how that will affect population and things like that. So a lot of the things that we criticize and we decry from other countries are things that we taught other countries to do. And so I think that's important to know and to teach to our kids. And I think that it's the ultimate patriotism to be able to critically reflect on your mistakes and to determine not to recreate those in the future.
Thank you for that really enlightening response.
I've got a quick question, a procedural question I wanted to ask. I'm getting a question from a viewer as a text. Do you want me to respond orally to that, or just type in my response as we go along?
Yeah, we'll have you respond out loud. So the question is for all our folks at home. What is one structural level change to American government that you would make in order to enact the most good change?
I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, we have good bones. We just need good people. There are two weak spots in our governmental structure. The first is the U.S. Senate. And when the Constitution was framed in 1787, the idea was that, look, we need to have all of these states, all 13 of these states in one union. So there was a lot of horse trading going on, and the Constitution is really a compromise between North and South, between big states and small states, between states that had lots of cities, states that had lots of farms. So the Constitution is really a compromise. But I think the U.S. Senate probably was one of the worst compromises, because you get a state like Wyoming with 600,000 people. They have 2 U.S. senators. California, with over 30 million people, they have 2 U.S. senators. So it skews the power, the US Senate, toward smaller states. And that is not good, because the direction of the global economy, the direction of our economy, the direction of our people, where they are moving to, particularly the most talented people are moving to, are not located in these states. I mean, South Dakota and North Dakota, they have more cows than people, but yet they have an influence in electing the president. I think we need to look at the US Senate. The second thing we need to look at is the Electoral College. It's ironic, when James Madison came up with this idea, he said, well, you know, I don't trust all of these people, particularly working class people and immigrants and stuff like that. They may get agitated by a demagogue. So what we need to do, we need to take their vote away from them and give it to people who know. Also, in James Madison's defense, if you had a presidential candidate from Massachusetts running for president, some guy on a farm in Georgia probably never heard of him, because there was no TV, there were no national newspapers. So his view was uninformed, but guaranteed the politicians and the leading planters of Georgia had heard of him. So they should be the ones who vote for president. So those are the reasons we got the Electoral College. And ironically, Madison wanted to avoid a demagogue getting elected. So he thought the Electoral College was a great standard to prevent that. It really hasn't turned out that way. But twice in the 21st century, and we're only 20 years into the 21st century, twice in the 21st century, the person who has achieved the greatest number of popular votes has not been elected president. And that's really an anomaly in the democratic world, because we tell our students that the person with the most votes should win, because that's the sentiment of the people. And the Electoral College is against that. In 2001, Hillary Clinton, at that time a US Senator from New York, introduced a bill into the US Senate. And you remember, we had the 2000 presidential election between Gore and Bush. It was Gore actually won the popular vote, but Bush won in the Electoral College. So that was the impetus behind that. Her bill called for the creation of a study group to study the Electoral College and see what reforms might be made to that system. Now, it wasn't a bill to abolish the Electoral College. It wasn't a bill to change the Electoral College. It was just a bill to create a study group. It failed miserably, bipartisanly. And the reason why both the Democratic and Republican parties don't want to touch the Electoral College is that almost all of our elections over the past 50 years come down to 6, 7, or 8 states. So what happens is that presidential campaigns can focus all of their resources on those 6, 7, 8 states. And of course, North Carolina is one of those battleground states. So we're going to see lots of advertising from both candidates over the course of the next several weeks. And we're going to see lots of visits by the candidates and their surrogates, vice presidential candidates. If you had a national campaign, you're going to have presidents going to Alaska, Hawaii, Nevada, Oregon. I can tell you right now, the states that Donald Trump is going to win on November 3rd. well, it probably won't be November 3rd because they have to count the absentee ballots and the vote by mail ballots. But and I can tell you the states that that Joe Biden is going to win. But what I can tell you are the results in these battleground states that will in fact determine the election. So basically what the Electoral College does is eliminate a national campaign.
Thank you for that really great lesson on the Electoral College and the importance of battleground states. I know when I lived in
I'm stressed.
California, I definitely did not feel the same urge around like who's going to win as compared to North Carolina, where the tensions are a little bit higher. So I understand that. So we'll switch to Jordan. I think she had a question.
Yeah, so Connor, this is for you. Brittany started talking about the idea of taking ownership and responsibility for your actions. So to say, as we're talking about our history and how we face our ugly truth. So how much responsibility belongs to the student to do their due diligence when it comes to finding housing costs? And is it easy for them to actually find out how much housing costs to live on campus?
I think there is some due diligence that students need to do, but at the same time, students are trapped in a system that overcharges. Because let's say for UNC Charlotte example, I want to go here, I want to live here, I want to go to this university. I only have so many options. The options are not very large on campus about price points and immediately off campus. And so students are kind of trapped in this medium because then you compromise on the accessibility of it because I might not be able to sign a 12-month lease. I might need a guarantor because I am a student. I don't make enough income. And a lot of regular complexes, traditional housing complexes, won't do that. And so a lot of students are kind of stuck in a hard place. But I do think there is a need for students to be aware of this housing costs. And I think that goes more importantly into parents and community members and alumni and faculty and staff being aware of what the college is really costing. At some institutions, it is very blatant of like, this is what we charge you, this is how you do. But on some other institutions, even within the UNC system, it varies drastically. So at UNC Charlotte, you can find multiple years of housing data on-campus rates available to you. They're all in PDFs, you can find them. At other institutions, you can't even find the most current rates. And so students are kind of stuck in this hard place, and especially at smaller institutions where they don't have as many options. Because UNC Charlotte, while we do have a large number of students who live on campus, we still don't have as many as other campuses, but we have more than most because we are a large institution. And so institutions like UNC Asheville, even UNCG, they don't have as many on-campus options as we do, so they have less price points. So then I think well, yes, there is due diligence for students to take ownership in that. It's also, we have to acknowledge the barriers that are put in place before students can even begin to take ownership of their decisions.
Do you feel like to a certain extent, students are being taken advantage of, like their ignorance and their just not knowing that these are things I need to be looking out for? Do you feel like they might be taking advantage of them?
Oh, definitely. I definitely believe that. I think one thing that really impacts it is going into politics is students are very transient in nature. They typically aren't registered at the institution they go to. So my first few years here at college, I wasn't registered in Charlotte to vote in Charlotte. I was registered in my hometown, but I wasn't registered in Charlotte. So I didn't have the political power in Charlotte per se to take advantage of that. And also a lot of students don't know that they can actually register on their college campuses to vote. They think they have to do it at their permanent addresses, right, which is their hometown, their parents' home, that type of thing. And so students don't have this ability to like kind of be in that process. But also a lot of these decisions are made decades out. So UNC Charlotte, we started this capital investment project that gave us the majority of the housing that we see today on campus a decade ago. It was a multi-level process, and it really started in the late 90s. And so, I mean, most college students today were babies, if not born at that time.
Oh
And
my gosh.
so like there is a difference in like how can students say no to that? How can students be
Right.
affected change when these decisions are passed years and years in advance? And so there's definitely that tug of war there, I think.
Okay, so we actually have a question for you from the audience. So what are your thoughts about free college?
So I think, well, one, free college is a policy that should be interrogated just like any other policy. So no matter where you're falling conservative or progressive or liberal, like it needs to be interrogated just like any other policy. I think the problem with a lot of free college plans today that we saw even in Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and like debated on the DNC platforms was they only included tuition. And from my talk, I tried to make this really big point about the cost of college isn't just about tuition. While at private institutions where tuition is $80,000 a year, tuition is a big deal. Tuition affordability is a big deal. But at UNC Charlotte, we have very affordable tuition because we're an in-state school, we're publicly funded. But our tuition, while our tuition is publicly funded through the state budget, housing is not. Housing is treated as an auxiliary service, just like our football program. And so our housing programs at every public institution across the state and the majority of institutions that I know and seen, they are self-funded. And so if housing wants to build a new service, they need to go get a loan. And so when we think about free college, we need to extend that to these places. And then I think free college needs to represent the total cost. So it doesn't also just need to include on campus. It needs to include off campus because for transfer students, they typically don't live on campus, they live off campus. And so there needs to be a system set up where whatever free college looks like, whatever program is put in place for everyone or people who are low socioeconomic, first generation, students of color, we need to include housing, we need to include on and off campus housing, and we also need to include food because food insecurity is a major issue at colleges.
Awesome, thank you for that. And Michael, I'm going to tee it up to you. It looks like we have a question for Brittany in the comments.
Yes, we do. Brittany, how long do you think it will take for American curriculum in public schools to kind of like catch up to the increased realization that a lot of our history that is taught is incorrect or whitewashed? So like in layman's terms, how long will it take for us to stop idealizing and idolizing Columbus in our history books?
I was muted, sorry. Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, my dissertation research is looking at the experiences of current Native students who are in urban schools and their experiences with the curriculum. And what I'm finding is that their experiences are, as it relates to the curriculum specifically, are almost identical to what mine were 10 and 20 years ago, and then also what my parents were. So learning that Columbus discovered America, so that meant learning that Columbus was this good and noble explorer who came to America and paved the way for this new white city on a hill, kind of like narrative. And then also they are still dressing up as Indians, like on Thanksgiving. So they'll wear like the paper headdresses, and then the other kids will dress as pilgrims. And so we're not seeing very much change from what was happening in the 70s and 80s to what is happening now. But I would say that outside of curriculum, there are a lot of strides that are being made. For example, with the Washington football team changing their name, that's a major step forward. Land of the Lakes removed the Native woman from their imagery. And so these are good steps forward to kind of remove this or kind of push away from this commitment that Americans have to this narrative of natives being like people of the past or savage or animalistic. So I think that those are good strides, but I think for curriculum, it's difficult. We are very committed to this like kind of romanticized idea of the noble savage of natives being a particular kind of way that does not mesh with the ways that we actually are. And so I think that it will be difficult to do. And I'm not sure how long it will take. I was speaking with one student who said that his teacher was very upset with this recent push to change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. And then his teacher actually said, "What have Indigenous people ever done for this country?" While he's sitting in the class, this is like a 12-year-old kid. And so what is he supposed to say? I mean, there's like a lot of power dynamics going on here with it being a teacher and a student. And so I think that even beyond like this commitment to stereotyping native people, there is this commitment to also keeping Columbus as this like beacon of whatever he is to us, which does not mesh with the reality of who he was as a person. And so I think that the more the truth is exposed and presented to people, the more uncomfortable they'll be with having people like that celebrated as heroes in our schools.
Can I piggyback on Brittany's comment? One of the great problems in this area are textbooks. Textbook publishers have to appeal to the broad middle. They can't offend anybody because, for example, Texas, $2 billion spent on textbooks. They have the Texas School Book Depository. You may remember the School Book Depository from the Kennedy assassination. So the state of Texas buys these textbooks. So basically, publishers are geared toward this mass market. And when you have a mass market, you have to level everything. So in 1996, I got together with a few other colleagues, 4 other colleagues, and we decided that we were going to write an American history textbook called The American Journey. And the basic premise of this textbook was that our nation since 1776 has been on a journey to fulfill the wonderful ideals noted in the Declaration of Independence. But there have been numerous detours on that journey along the way. And we've had to pull back on the road many times. So that was our premise. In 2018, we just published the 8th edition of the American Journey. So it was a successful project. But in it's published by Pearson, which is probably one of the is the leading textbook publisher in the world. And we constantly, even today, we constantly have to go back and forth. So, well, will this sell in Mississippi? Will this sell in Montana? Will this sell in New England? Textbook publishers want to make a profit. And you don't make profits if you offend a lot of people. And quite honestly, a lot of American history is offensive. So the problem is what students read and what students teach are not always the whole story. I always tell my students, you can't tell the whole story, but tell the story whole. In other words, all parts of it. And that's what we try to do with the American Journey. But I must say that this is an outlier. We've never had much success in Texas, by the way. But anyway, that's I think that textbooks are part of the problem.
Yeah, I would agree. Just really quickly, I would agree textbooks are a major problem, but I also think that if there's nothing that can be done about the textbooks, then there needs to be something done about teacher training. For example, they still teach what is it called, the Huckleberry Finn book, and in that book they say the N-word repeatedly throughout the book. And when I was in school, actually my teacher would say the word, and she wasn't Black, and so it was very awkward. But now I've read about studies where they still have to teach this book in a lot of different areas, but the teachers are going beyond the text and talking about the blatant problems that are presented in that book. And so I think that that's something that teachers or curriculum developers could be tasked with, helping teachers go beyond the text. So because it's not appropriate to teach students lies. And I feel like I spent a significant portion of my post K through 12 career unlearning a lot of the different things that I learned in the public school system, which were just untrue. And there's even books, there's a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me. I mean, there's so many books devoted to this kind of like unlearning concept, which I think a lot of Americans should devote themselves more to.
But the good news is that we have learned something. When I was a kid, I remember in elementary school singing "When Columbus Sailed the Ocean Blue in 1400," and you know, Columbus was a big hero, especially among my Italian friends. Now, however, it's the story becomes much more complicated, and by being more complicated, it becomes more accurate.
That's true. They still sing that in schools, though, by the way.
Do
Oh
they
my gosh, that's mortifying.
Yeah, I talked so to a few of the students who I've talked to so far. They said that they're still learning that Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Yeah.
That's mortifying. So we're going to take a quick second. Michael has to give some shout outs to our sponsors and supporters. So Michael.
Yes, so this is our final night, so we wanted to give a final shout out to all of our sponsors and all of our partners who've helped make this event possible. So that includes the Alumni Association here on campus, the Residence Hall Association, the Family Council, Center for Wellness Promotions, Office of Identity, Equity and Engagement, the Dean of Students Office, the University Career Center, IO and Emerging Media Communications, who've helped us with all of the video production needs for this year's event, and then Leadership and Community Engagement, who's been a partner as well. So we're really grateful for all the ways that they contribute, because the event is not possible off of Jordan and I's passion alone. It's possible through all of this other support, as well as our speakers. And then tonight's raffle winner is Jenny Wood. Jenny, you'll get an email and you will get to contact you about how you can get this really cool book that we made back in March when we thought we were going to be doing an in-person event. We'll be raffling that off and sending that out to you.
Let March go already. Please let March go. But we also need to thank Grant and Yasmin for hosting this virtual event, and a big shout out, big kudos, big props to our girl Bryn, who is covering the social media and taking care of a lot of the assets and getting things done on the back end for us. So Bryn, thank you for that. And we're going to close out this session and with asking you all to give us a 1-sentence response to this question. What advice would you give to someone who wants to give a TEDx talk?
My advice would be wait until COVID has passed so that you can do it in person and just practice.
My advice is to be interesting.
Connor?
I think my advice goes a lot out to students who don't typically give TED Talks. Be passionate and don't let anyone tell you you can't do it, because you can.
Awesome. Well, thank you three for joining us live tonight in this pandemic season. Hopefully we'll end soon. We appreciate your participation, your patience, and sticking with this process throughout. We are happy that you all finished with us. We did it. You did it. You did it, most importantly. So thank you all so much. And that closes us for TEDx UNC Charlotte 2020.
So
Thank
stay
you,
tuned.
guys.
Yeah, of course. Stay tuned.
Great
Hopefully.
to meet you, Connor and Brittany.
So yes, thank you to all of our speakers tonight and for all of your great discussion after. It's clear that all three of you are very passionate and very well informed on your topics. Stay involved with TEDx UNC Charlotte. You can find out more by following us on Instagram at TEDx UNC Charlotte or checking us out at tedx.uncc.edu. We hope to be back potentially for an in-person event in spring. Fingers crossed everything works well with COVID. But thanks everyone for participating and for the TEDx UNC Charlotte committee for all the work you've done. Have a good night, everybody.